started bonsai, I asked my teacher, why are there not more pine bonsai? And he said, we can't import them. And so I did the math, and I thought, well, if we don't start growing them now, we'll never have them. And so I've been growing pines from seed for 31 years now. And so I've worked with pines at the beginning, middle, and later stages. We have different techniques based on the kind of stage of development. Today, we're going to be working with trees, not in the first stage, not in the middle stages. We're going to be more mature stages. And we all know that everything gets better as it matures. And so we're going to be working with the more mature trees. This work is far more tedious, I will say, at times. And for me, I find it a lot more challenging. And if you can get past the kind of tedium of it, it can be kind of fun. Because what's cool about doing work this time of year is that you get to make more artistic decisions. And even though this pine, when we're done with it, will be roughly that tall and roughly this wide, we can make it look really pretty based on the work that we do right now. And so that's what we'll go through today, is what kind of controls we have to work on. In general, what kind of work are we doing on pines this time of year? Decandling. Nothing is on fire, there's no wax. What? Does anyone not know what decandling is? And so my last name starts with a D. I don't see anything that resembles a candle. We have an unfortunate nomenclature in bonsai where as a bud elongates, we pretend to ourselves it looks like a candle. As soon as the needles come out and it stops looking like a candle, when we prune the tree, we call that decandling. The Japanese is not much more helpful. The direct translation of this technique translates to bud cutting. Menkiri, bud cut. And so we don't have helpful words in English or Japanese, so we just let that one go. That's fine. Why? So decandling is simply, well, someone tell me, what's decandling?
Bud cutting.
And what do we mean by that? What's a bud? New growth pushing out. Is any part of the tree not new growth pushing out?
Yeah, I guess that part near the
So what decandling is, it's a technique whereby we remove all of a single shoot that has grown this year. And in general, we'll be removing the bulk of the new growth on the bulk of the pines that we work with. That's very easy. I'll teach you the basics of what it is, and that much we'll have straight. The only hard part is then figuring out when we don't do this. So, what is this cookie technique? Why do we cut off all of the hard work the tree has done in spring? Why do we decandle? There's got to be multiple good reasons for that. Any ideas? Yes, you in the hat.
Oh.
Any idea why we cut off all the new growth in the spring?
You're redirecting growth, you're encouraging inner bud work.
Say more about that first one, redirecting growth. What does that mean?
Yeah, you don't want to go vertical, you want to go horizontal growth.
Well, we cut off the vertical and the horizontal ones. And so how does it help us get that?
Yeah, more budding.
More budding. Yeah. Thicker stems and thicker trunks. This is the opposite. This will get us skinnier stems and skinnier trunks. Yeah, because we will get thicker stuff if we don't do that.
Too vigorous.
Ramification. We can control vigor. What are some other things we can do? To balance the tree. And so those are the main ones. When we have a tree that produces a big long shoot like this, we may or may not be happy with the shoot length. When we remove spring growth, the summer growth is likely to be smaller. And so it's a way to keep internodes in check. That's one of the first things we can get by decandling. The other thing we can get is bifurcations, whereas in some places one shoot like this may have grown, in summer we might have this replaced by two smaller shoots. I'm going to borrow a couple small shoots from this tree. And so if I cut this one strong shoot, I might end up with two small shoots in its place. So that's what we're trying. So if we cut this, we might expect this to grow in its place. Now, something else that we get is balance. Someone said balance, so say more about that. Nancy's on to something. What do we mean by balance?
So overall,
Is it gonna fall
bulk of the
over?
tree, and so you don't have fast growth on this side and slow growth on the other. I mean, to simplify it.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, pines don't grow with equal vigor from top to bottom, from inside to outside. And there are a lot of different tweaks we can make when we decandle that can help ensure that pines have balanced growth. Why do we want balanced growth on pines? heavy in one part, other parts of the tree can be really weak. And so we actually, decandling is one thing we can use to, it's not that it makes the tree more healthy, but it helps us preserve the health of branches that might otherwise get a little bit weak. So, in terms of actually making the cut when you decandle, let me find a good example that we can use here. Here's a little tiny branch that has 3 little tiny sub-branches on it. I know it's really small and not all of you have laser vision. If I were to cut one of these off, it might look like this. So, the number one job we're going to do when decandling is identifying the difference between the current year's growth, the shoot developed from about this point up in 2025, and the previous year's growth. How can we distinguish current year from previous year growth? There's a gap. There's very often a little space, which we call the neck or the stem, that kind of gives us a clue that we have a difference between one year's growth and another year's growth. What else can we see? Needle length. They're not always the same color or length. And so in this case we have long needles followed by short needles below. What else might we notice? Color. We're often going to see a little bit of yellow at the base of the new needle, and then maybe some darkness at the top. Old needles in general might be darker, they might be lighter. So we're going to be looking at color and length and a gap between the growth. Anything else? Those are the 3 that come to mind. Now, yeah.
Also, there's a difference in the color of the part of the branch from which the needles are growing.
Yes, sometimes the stem itself is bright green and the branch below that will be brown, which I'm covering up so you can't see. All of those are likely, but there are cases where there's no gap, the needles are the same color, and the needles are the same length, and the stem is the same color. What do you do in that case? What do you do in that case?
Get down.
Ask me where it goes. Any ideas? So there are cases when sometimes there's no gap and sometimes there's no rational place to decandle. There's different reasons for that depending on the time of year in which that bud grew. And so in that case, look closer and find a difference in the needle, find a difference in the color, find what may or may not be a gap. One of the things that I use most, there is a 4th thing to look for, look at the angle at which the needles come out. New needles are typically closer together and the old needles are typically splayed out and protrude at larger angles from the base of that stem. That is going to be your clue. Now, when it's time to make the cut, is there anything I should be careful of when I make that cut, or does it not matter how we make the cut? Yes, we want to cut straight. We're making a square cut. We don't want to cut at an angle. Why? Yeah, theoretically, it can have an effect on, right, if the summer growth can potentially become a little wonky. And that is real, but it's a very subtle thing, where if I cut at an angle, maybe one bud will come out strong and the second bud will come out weaker. It's real, I've measured it, but it's so small, it's a small thing. So yeah, make a square cut. What else comes to mind? Where do I cut? Do I cut near the top of the gap, the bottom of the gap, somewhere in the middle? Bottom. The bottom. So when you say the bottom, like all the way down to where those other needles are? Yeah. Or do I leave a little bit of the good tissue in the cut? What's that? So what I would suggest is you always cut in a place where you keep at least a little bit of the new tissue. And that's really important because the new buds that form, which are called adventitious buds, they actually grow from a little tiny ring right above, like within a millimeter of where that low rung of needles is. So if we cut really, really low, if we're pushing down where those needles are, and or maybe we take off some of these old needles, that we actually aren't decandling the right way at that point because there's no place for those buds to grow. So we're going to leave a little tiny stub or stem. You can leave longer stems or stubs on stronger branches and smaller ones on smaller ones, or you can cut them all clean. I doubt the garden has an opinion about which approach you take here. You wouldn't know what they did here last year. Does anyone know if there's a preference of doing one way or another? Cheryl? Yeah?
When we did it with Ted, he had always said leave it a little bit.
Leave a little bit. And so I tend to aim for leaving about an eighth of an inch roughly. And the
You
way
would say
I,
it would fall off if you leave enough, it will eventually fall off.
and or you have to go back and cut it off. So either way, it's a solvable problem. The way I do is I kind of let my scissors rest on top of the needles, and usually the angle of the needles below and the thickness of the scissors will put the cut at right about that 1.8-inch space, and so you end up in the right spot. If you are new to decandling, and who among us has never decandled a pine? Yes.
I have had it.
Okay. So if you have not decandled, here is the number one mistake you are going to make. You're going to open up your scissors just all ready to go, and you're going to drive the scissors right into there. And you're going to cut some of the other needles. You're just going to go right like that. And you'll make the cut, and you'll pat yourself on the back. Got it. And what you want to do, and this is a fancy technique, it's the only thing I'm going to teach that's fancy all day long. It requires a minor modicum of manual dexterity. There's another F word in there. Try to enter with the scissors closed through that first set of needles, like that. Open up the scissor right when you get to the stem, and don't go past that, or you might cut needles on the back side. So you go in with the scissors closed, you open them a tiny bit, and then you take that last little thing off. And then you have a little tiny stub at the bottom. You will be judged very harshly by your peers if they catch you cutting through needles, cutting at an angle, or otherwise damaging the tree. And the reason for that is, even though it'll look great today, in 2 weeks, Daniel's going to come back and wonder, why are the tips of all these brown? And if you have a pine, you know what a brown tip looks like on a pine, and that's something you don't want. Now, is there any other mistake you can make when you decandling?
Trim at the wrong place.
You cut in the wrong place. Yeah, sometimes you'll cut too high. Sometimes there's needles, and then a gap, and then more needles, and so you just cut at the wrong spot. Sometimes you're going to cut too low. Those are two ways you can go wrong. How else can you take? Yeah, exactly. The mistake that I'm most worried about, I'll say two categories of mistakes that I'm most worried about are, if the tree's weak, don't decandle. If it hasn't been fertilized well in spring, don't decandle. And so you're all off the hook for making that mistake, because I will hopefully personally look at every single tree before it gets decandled, and I will provide specific operating instructions for that given tree. And that way you're off the hook for making that kind of decision. But there are a few trees in the garden that are a little bit weak and we're not going to decandle. What might indicate the tree's not ready to be decandled when you're just looking at it? Color? Color. What might you see color-wise that would tell you not to do that? Right. If it's bright yellow, or if it's covered with needle cast and some kind of disease, or if it's covered with insects. So yes, color's one. What's another reason why we might not want it? What if the color's perfect? Are there any options or situations? Kelly?
Well, if it is not very dense.
Well, what if the tree's not very dense, but there's really long shoots?
Good.
That's more a case in young trees. So density isn't necessarily a cause to decandle or not, but density is the number one thing we'll talk about when we get into talking about cutback a little bit. Any other reason?
The young tree and it's being long, would be the happiest.
Oh, I'll show you if I can find a good example of a long shoot.
Right.
You decandle.
You can decandle?
Yeah.
Oh.
In fact, what I'll say is you could actually cut if it's a young shoot that's really, really long. Not only can you decandle at the normal spot, but you can decandle even further back. And as long as you keep some of the old needles, it's really, really good.
Is there an age for starting decandling?
You start decandling for two reasons in terms of the age of the tree, or really the stage of development. One, decandle if you need to create ramification where there's no ramification. In other words, if you've got really big long shoots and you need it to divide into kind of sub-branches, that's one indication for decandling. The other one is when you want to create more dense branching. That's it. If a tree is young and your goal is thickening, you're probably not going to decandle much at all. So depending on the size of the tree you're making, you might start in 5 years, you might start in 25 years. It really depends on your goals for growing it and how you're treating it. The most common mistake for people growing young trees is they start decandling too early.
That's what that was part behind my question.
Yeah.
I thought people might get by it at the store and they're all.
Yeah, a lot of people,
Or wagging.
yeah, they buy a little baby pine, they take it home, and then they decandle it, and then they write me and say, I just decandled, now what do I do? I said, wait 10 years before you decandle again. And then it's kind of simple.
What happens when the tree is wired?
If the tree's wired, there won't be wires on the new candles unless someone wired it. So that's all.
The pine,
Yeah.
the pine is wired.
Whether or not it's wired will not affect whether or not we decandle. So you're totally fine to decandle wired or not.
So can I come back to this is a young tree and you don't suggest to decandle? It's okay to just keep growing on these long things?
So for those who don't know, I've written about 654 articles on how to grow pines from scratch and how to decandle. So take notes, even though it's all written down, do take notes because we remember things better when we write them down. It runs through our brains differently. But specifically on how to do long-term development of pines, I don't know that anyone else has spent, invested, wasted, whatever, hours of their life teaching people how to grow trees from scratch. There's a lot of resources I could point you to on the website. Oh, and there's 2 amazing books. By the way, there are a few extra in the new book, and there's even instructions on decandling there. They won't teach you how to grow a tree from scratch, but they will teach you everything you need to know to save to keep this tree healthy. So lots of resources on that. There are just lots of techniques for where and when and how you cut to do things. But before I turn anyone loose, can I hold on? Yeah.
If the tree is wet,
Wet?
like
Yeah.
for example, it is raining and you wanna decandle, what happens?
In general, if a tree's wet, you can do all the work you'd normally do, it just won't be as fun. You can wire, I think there's a picture of me on the website wiring a tree in the rain. It's great fun, but it's totally fine. Yeah, totally fine. But one thing that I want you all to, oh yeah,
If you do notice that some needles have needle pads, should you pluck those needles?
you should tell the person who is in charge of the garden here, or whoever the crew chief is for the day, and let them deal with it.
No, what if it's your own?
Right. I was going to get to the second part of that. But this is actually an important thing. A lot of volunteers see a lot of stuff and they don't know what to do. Your job is to bring that to the attention of someone whose job it is to worry about that. And so I really want to underscore that. If you see anything you don't understand, someone will just love to hear about that from you. Because it's a lot better than not hearing. Because if you see 3 scale on there and you don't tell anyone, maybe by the time someone else notices, there's going to be hundreds of scale on there. In short, no, don't worry about picking the infected needles. In general, you want to find out which needles are infected, is the infection still active, and then what is the basic protocol for treating a tree based on that. Probably be fine.
So, I was told you notice needle pads when there's a little yellow stripe in the middle of the needle. And if you can get that needle out before it spreads down into the plant, you've saved the tree. That is not a correct way to deal with it.
So there might be a case in which there's one needle on a whole tree that has it, but usually you find patches of it at a time. And I don't know that you necessarily, depending on other conditions, whether or not you want to do all that. In general, that's when you'd want to do 2 things: stop overhead watering and or spray. And so the one health tip I'll give you all today is if you know what the problem is you have, what we're talking about is needle handling, which presents as banding or a little stripe on a needle. And telltale signs would be, say, a yellow band with kind of a brown dot in the middle somewhere, which would be the exact site of injury where that fungus is taking hold. Google the name of the problem you've got, whether it's a bug or disease, followed by the letters IPM, Integrated Pest Management. You'll find a university website which will tell you what it is, how to treat it, what things work, what things don't. If it doesn't give you good information, go to the next Google result and find that. University of California has some awesome IPM web resources. Clemson University, University of Missouri, there's a handful around the country I would always start there, and they'll give you a really good holistic overview of how to deal with it as well. Super helpful. But what I'm going to talk about is one of my pet peeves on pines, which is how do you handle pines? It's going to be very tempting today to see a bud down in there and to just reach in and grab it, move everything out of the way, and then cut it. What is wrong with that? You break needles. More important than that, you're going to poke yourself. And so for the preservation of your hands, don't ever reach down into a pine. If I want to wire, prune, or decandle or shoot right on the inside, how do I do that? How do I open? Like open sesame? What's Say it.
From the side.
From the side? How do I do that from the side? It's like way in.
Inside. Like the side that's open, no needles.
There's a lot of no sides here. I want to decandle that one down there. Under. Yes. One awesome thing about pines is in general the needles are going like this. We can always start at the bottom and go up through the needles without damaging them. And so I will say that it takes a long time to get used to it. If you're not used to handling pines, you will make this mistake. Daniel will find out about it in 2 weeks. He has a good memory, so he'll know who worked on that pine.
I'm taking photographs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the security cameras that aren't wired in. You gotta make people think they're being watched.
Well, they all work.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I do is to work on those interior things. I do spread things apart, but I always start from the bottom. So to get into this worst spot, I might start with both hands from underneath and then grab and isolate the area I'm working with, and then when I'm done, my hands will keep going up. Same kind of thing here. If I want to do those interior shoots there, I might find a way to kind of come up here, over here, and then I can pull something down like that. That's another good trick, where you come up through the inside and then come out. So there's a lot of ways. There's a little gap here. See, I move this tiny little branch to get out of the way, and then I can move these. And so this is just, how many of you find this really natural to handle pines this way? Yeah. How many of you did it this way your first time and never messed up? What do you think? Is it just an intuitive thing? You just automatically, if you want to touch that, you automatically go into the side.
No, I haven't seen it demonstrated.
You haven't seen, well, now you have seen it demonstrated, unless I'm doing that bad a job.
It's a,
Do you ever teach people how to handle pines differently than that, or is that how you teach them? Do they listen? Yeah, good answer. You set the bar high for everyone here today.
It's like if you've ever worked with grooming any kind of animal, you always groom in the direction of the hair growth.
If you want to keep on their good side,
If you, yeah, exactly. So it's,
Or if you want to make their owners happy when they come to pick
tree's
them up.
good side, and so you just think about.
Think of it as the
grooming
coat,
it in
yeah.
that way.
So for the furry animal lovers, that is really good advice. So this is the absolute basic. Is anyone still terrified about decandling? Oh, you're not. Are you actually a little bit concerned about decandling? Nick, come up.
Ah, yeah.
Is there blood in it? Fresh sugar?
How long have you been volunteering at the garden? Oh, there'll be
a year.
1 year.
1 year.
Have you worked on the pines yet?
No.
Oh. Are you good with sharp things? If I told you to, quote, decandle any one shoot on this pine, what would you do?
It's a might help me.
Great. Grab any, so you can ask any of them questions, you just can't ask me. Tell her, where does she start?
Look,
Something really sticking
Number
out.
one, remember what he said about going in. Number
Okay,
one,
I'm gonna pick this one because it's close.
go under.
From under.
Number one, go under.
Go like this.
Yeah, scissors are
No, I know,
closed.
but
I'll
yeah,
give you the play by play.
Just pick one like this.
Yeah.
Something gonna break those.
And she's reaching in the top with her left hand, that's good.
That's good. Okay.
And then you cut. I won't say my scissors are great.
Scissors are great.
There are no signs of broken or bent needles anywhere. You're done, you're safe.
I'm done.
Now you're certified, you can do
See
it.
if Sue can do it.
You know what it is? It's finding, the terrifying part for me is finding the wear.
Yes, and so that takes getting used to. But Sue's demonstrated now that this is a very doable thing. So if you have any questions, ask her.
I also feel like it's easier when you have a
Yes.
Well, absolutely. I
Very nice
absolutely
to
agree with that.
So the question just
Deadly without
what
advice.
order do you work on the pine? Do you start at the top, you start in the middle, you start at the bottom? I'll tell you what people normally do, and then I'll tell you what I recommend.
But they're really good.
What's the good order for decandling? Where do I start? What's that? Quadrant. What quadrant? Any quadrant? So that's one answer. What's another answer? Why at the top?
Because you're less apt. First, anything that falls, you can
It's going to fall on a lower branch, and if I just finish decandling that mode, I want to cover it with stuff that I can go back and clean up later. So if I know I'm going to decandle all at once, all in one day, the quadrant I'll start with is always the top, and I'll work my way down. And usually the very top is the least fun part because we either have to get up on tippy toes and or we have to reach and or it's uncomfortable to work like this all day long unless you're a bricklayer or you do drywall for a living. Where does everybody start? Pretty much raise your arms to 90 degrees, walk towards the tree. People pretty much start right there. And that's with wiring, with plucking, with doing anything. And it's kind of rational that we do that. It's just not necessarily a smart thing to do with the tree. So yeah, I'd recommend today we'll start on the top and work our way down. So once we start, do we want to finish that tree? I would say within a rational amount of time, yes. There are different techniques for decandling where sometimes you decandle all on one day and sometimes you put gaps of time between it. If you're starting with everything, especially if you start with the top, you're going to do the whole thing that day. And if you can't finish it that day, then do it the next day. Maybe the day after that if something bad interrupts you from doing that. But you don't want to do the top part of the tree and then come back a week or two later. What you'll have done is made the bottom part weaker and the top part stronger, which is the exact opposite of what we want. Yes, Kelly?
I've done it once before, and it was kind of scary at the end how sparse and bald it looked compared to how full it is now. Is that what we should expect?
Being scared or did it scare
No,
us?
it's gonna be much bolder.
So the trees are going to be much balder, and if they weren't adequately plucked, I might tell you to pluck off half the remaining needle. For a really strong, healthy, dense pine, I'm going to, after decandling, I'm going to pull every single needle on the tree except for 2 pairs per branch at the most extreme. That looks really plucked. We're not going to do that anywhere here today. But there might be some opportunities to do some needle thinning. In general, the primary time to thin needles is at fall, but now is an additional time to thin needle. And just based on what I see, is the tree balance, is it healthy, what's the overall needle density after decandling, that's when we'll decide whether or not we need to make it look scary. And yeah, it does look scary. And what I found is a lot of things in life are scary. And most people don't prune their pines enough. And that way they're too dense, and so the interior branches all die out, and the pines get bigger and bigger every year. I just described most mediocre pine bonsai in America. If you do the scarier thing and cut back a little bit, and or pull some needles somewhere during the year, then you can keep trees reasonable size for a very long period. Yes?
Can you, I mean, this seems like this might dip into the question I had earlier about judging how dense you should cut back depending on the density of the overall tree in different areas. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, so in general, you're going to expect more density in areas that get really good light and or areas that are really strong due to just how the tree's growing. And there can be different aspects to that. In general, the way we decandle isn't affected as much by density, but how we prune will very much be affected by density. And so one thing is a lot of the trees in the garden have slowly and very stealthily been trying to get one over on us and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bigger the tree gets, the smaller the trunk looks. And so I will likely be coming by looking for opportunities not to make the tree bigger, but to make the tree smaller. And that's harder to do. I won't expect you to know how to do that. Is anyone here super comfortable doing that kind of cutback on pines? Super comfortable, huh?
Only
You
if
said you were
only
afraid.
if you're watching.
So don't believe Kelly, maybe, we'll see. If I'm watching, that's fine, but you're comfy doing that kind of work? Great. What are the criteria you use when you're doing cutback, whether now or?
Preserving the overall shape and the direction wherever the branch goes.
Yes, we're looking at directionality, we're looking at shape, and we're looking at density together. I found out this morning that I'll be coming back in fall, apparently that's happening, and we'll pick a day for that, and we will cover pruning a little bit more and needle plucking at that time. Yeah.
When you talk of this workshop, is only on bonsai or on the pine tree out there that's growing?
Oh, these techniques, there's multiple different ways of addressing pine spring growth. These techniques can be used on landscape trees. They're not necessary, but it's a great tool that we can apply to landscape trees depending on our goal for how dense or full we want our landscape trees to grow. Yes.
I'm confused talking about what kinds of needle to either the candle cleaning or the pulp. And I was told that different times, that the way to tell is if you, when the candle grows, if you pull the needle and it comes out too easily, it's too soon, and you should wait until it's, I mean, can you talk a little
So this is
bit
a
about
great
that?
question. How do you figure out when to decandle? And the advice that had been taught is that based on how secure the needle is on the tree, that would be an indication of when to decandle. And for the first time in 30-something years, I can say the answers to all those questions are in the new book. I never been able to say that before.
Are you selling it today?
I think the garden will be selling it today. I do have it here. I'm very bad at promoting anything.
Bring some to sell?
But I do have a tiny number of copies of that. So, how do you know when to decandle in any tree in general? This is more for fun. We're just going to decandle what's here today, so you don't need to worry about that. But at home, how do you know when to decandle?
You can see it sometimes. Very good visual.
I disagree. Because what's interesting about decandling is the only thing we do not care about at all is what the tree looks like. Because we're about to cut all those branches off. What we're doing is, if the goal is by the end of the year, we are going to remove a bunch of growth and we're going to replace it with summer growth. The only question we're really asking is how many days are left in the growing season. So let's pretend today is June 25th. Need to pretend. The growing season right here in this garden is going to be between now and roughly, we'll say October 25th. July, August, September, October. We've got 4 months left in the growing season. If we cut today, that means we're starting the clock the second we apply our scissors to the branch. And so, little does it matter what it looks like now, but the fact that there are 120 days left in the growing season matters a lot. If we wait 1 month, that is a 25% reduction in the number of days left in the growing season. Here's where that becomes relevant for you. If you decandle and at the end of the year your branches are bigger than you want, what do you do to fix that next year? Decandle later. Decandle later. And if everything's smaller than you want, what does that mean? Or it means you need to move because there's no heat where you put it, but that's But yeah, in general, what you're doing is pay attention to the day on which you decandle. We all have witnesses that we were here on the 25th of June. And we're going to find out what these trees look like at the end of the year. Other things affect how the growth comes out, but in general, that's how we come up with the time. Here's why I mentioned that it's not just no, but an actual disagreement is, I work all over the country. In Seattle, when they decandle, the candles have not opened up yet. They're decandling before the needles are fully mature. I also work in the South, and when I'm in Carolina or Texas, South Texas, the trees are super full, the needles are giant, and I'm doing it a whole month later. So in general, across the continent, you're starting decandling as early as about May 15th, the very earliest, and you're decandling as late as early August in general. So that's nationwide. Within any given microclimate, you're going to grab about no more than a quarter of that time. And then your experience will guide you based on that. And so I tell people, if you don't know what to do, decandle around solstice, see what happens in fall, and then adjust after that. Within 2 to 3 years, you'll probably get a good recipe. So that's kind of a trick question, but that's why. Depending on where you are, they can be very different.
Obviously, ideal thing to work on your plants twice a year. Different, so now I can work on them all year long. So is that what you're saying too? If you just,
So interesting.
Well, I'm speaking of this region.
Exactly. So for this region, you can get away with working on pines twice a year, 3 if you count repotting. And that's why I started some pine study groups down here. I come down 2 to 3 times a year to do this kind of work this time of year. That's literally why I'm here. And then in fall I come back so we can do the plucking and pruning. And generally you can do your fall work all winter long. Pretty much for us, November, December, January, up until they start growing in February, we can wire and pluck and prune our trees. Tasks that you can do any day of the year on pine bonsai include removing branches. You can remove a branch any old day of the year. Not necessarily a decandling shoot, but like if we don't need this branch, I can cut this branch off any old time. It might have an effect on the growth on the rest of the tree depending on the given branch, but that's one kind of thing we can do all day long. A really scary thing one of my teachers in Japan said is you can repot a pine any day of the year. Don't, however, expect to do the same amount of root work and or have the same results as if you do it at the optimal time, which is right the day before you see it starting to grow. That's like the best time to repot. Best day of the year is the day before you see it starting to grow. I haven't figured that one out either, but it's a really good time to repot. And I do that with deciduous, so I have way too many pines at home, and so I know they're more flexible. I start a little earlier and I finish a little bit later on the pines. But deciduous trees, when I go outside, the day I start to see something grow, I drop what I'm doing, I repot that tree that day, because that's the optimal time. The reason you want to repot on the optimal day is you can be more aggressive with the root work and the tree will respond really, really well. You do aggressive work, the further you get outside of that bell curve shaped opportunity window, the more stressful it will be for the trees. All right. Yes.
In the same way that wildlife will respond to the stress of a burn zone or outside a burn zone, and we've had that recently here, do you notice that in pines, bonsai pines, like a stress response?
Will the pines, are you talking about pines that have experienced that directly or indirectly?
No, just like
In
the
general.
smoke or,
So-
within a mile, they haven't actually been burned, but they're within.
Yeah, fires actually can have effect on pine bonsai very far away. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, one of the horrible years of fires in Northern California, all of our trees were covered in ash. All the pines turned a different color that year. I don't know if it was because of the gases in the air, the particulates on the foliage, the particulates in here, the water. No idea. These are very uncontrolled phenomena. But they did turn a funny color that year. So I will say our trees are not totally immune to what's going on in the broader context. It was the only time I ever noticed that, I think. But yeah, I believe that happened. I mean, that's not scientific, but from all I could tell, it appeared that the trees within days turned. They all shifted from one kind of hue to kind of a darker, bluer cast I've never seen before. I'm very sensitive to color, and so I thought that was really weird. Anyone still have hesitations about getting started on a pine if we were to just cut you loose on one? Great, that means any of you can ask any of you for starters. If you need some help. What I want to do is watching me sit in this, one other thing I'll say. In decandling time of year, I tend to use a tweezer in the left hand and a scissors in the right. Here's why. I can grab a shoot that I'm going to cut. I can move it any which way I need to move it without touching anything else on the tree. And then I can make it as easy as possible to get to where I need to cut and give myself a right angle so I can make a square cut. And I just kind of let that fall. This is really handy if you don't want to get poked, and it can save you from reaching in. Not everyone is used to using tweezers all day long, and I will recommend And see, the needles are just like falling right off. So it's not that that's not a true thing in this case. Maybe that's a good LA tip, I don't know. But I can make these cuts and toss it out. And then by the time I get into the middle, if I really needed to get those guys, I would probably find a hole here, hold these down like that, and then I have the ability to get in here. Or if I'm really fancy, I can do that with the back of my hand, and then I can use a couple extra fingers. 2 fingers can move branches out of the way, 2 more fingers can isolate these, and then I can make 2 cuts right here too. Are there any shoots you're not going to decandle on these trees?
I was just gonna ask you that.
Weak shoots. So some teachers hold you cut all the weak ones, some teachers hold you leave all the weak ones. What criteria might be applied to either one? This is one thing that you're not all going to get. You have a guess about that. You know the basics, but this is one of those.
Branch thickness?
No, not branch thickness. Not the health of the tree. Same order. Because we're deciding whether or not to cut something small.
Smaller camel opposed to a smaller camel.
So here's how I think of it. A, if you have a teacher that says always do one or always do the other, that's probably fine in different regions of Japan. Some always do one, some always do the other. The way I think about it is, if that little tiny weak branch is really important to you, you've got a big long bare stretch and you love a branch right there, if it's precious, maybe keep it. Today, if you have a question about whether or not to keep it, go ahead and keep it. The other school of thought, which would be kind of the Kura school of thought, the kind of more Tokyo area of Japan, what they will teach is cut everything on the tree. Why? They want to get 2 things. One, get as strong a stress response as possible to get more overall budding on the tree. And 2, the growth that does come out, make it as even as possible. If you keep those little guys, those needles will become really long and all the other needles will be short. If you're showing a tree, that doesn't look as good. The garden will look good. I find that both approaches are annoying in that if you keep the small things, they're alive, they're healthy and well, but you have these big long needles, that may or may not be a problem based on the tree. And if you decandle them, they're just going to stay weak forever, and you'll find you're decandling those weak buds forever, and that doesn't do you much good. I'm more likely to want to thin out a weak area where there might be 3 or 4 buds, cut them down to 1, and then hope that 1 bud gets stronger so I decandle and get a good response. That's beyond our scope today. If you have a question about whether or not to cut something small, leave it and it'll be fine. Yes, that sounds good? Good. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
So if it's a weaker bud, would you say today you're going to do the whole tree?
Yeah.
Except for maybe the weaker buds. Maybe it goes for 10
For
days.
2 weeks ago. Because we're starting the clock earlier on the weak buds.
Okay.
If we're going to try to stretch out our decandling window, we're going to do only the strong ones today, and we're going to do the weak ones. Yeah, we're going to leave the strong ones and cut the weak ones today, because we're starting that clock to give them a head start on the race. It's who's going to run around the fastest. On this tree, the very longest shoots are about this big, which is, just to be specific, we've got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, about 19 pairs of needles. And I'm going to say on very weak shoots at the bottom, very weak shoots, let's cut this whole branch off. 4. So we're between 4 and 19. If I could go back in time 2 weeks ago, I could cut all of these off, and that would help make them a little bit stronger. Or we cut all these today and come back and do that. Some people teach this is a good technique, some people teach it's a waste of time. I will teach you it's an extremely effective technique if you're really good at not missing a lot of small things, which is just not easy. Today we're going to do the candle the whole thing technique, and maybe I'll tell you to pluck some needles we can balance it that way. Does that help a little bit? With that, I think our plan is, because actually the light's not
I'm
bad
afraid.
out there. Yeah?
You know, California has really scorching sun.
Yes.
I know we're supposed to put this candle bonsai or tree out in the sun, but are we supposed to?
I believe we have mildish weather this week, so these can all go right back out into the full sun.
You don't have to cover it or put
Correct.
it inside.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's mild where I live up in Alameda, Northern California, so I don't worry about it. I've never once protected a pine.
Yeah.
But in general, we don't recommend people protect pines. Cryptomeria, you prune those. Well, you mist those once an hour and put them in the shade for a few weeks after pruning. Like those are extremely sensitive. Deciduous trees, don't even think about it. If you're revealing maple leaves that are down on the interior and now they get sun, definitely you're going to keep those in shade spot. But pines do pretty well when you give them a lot of sun. The only case in which I'd ever recommend protecting a pine is if it was going from, say, a consistent month of highs of 68 degrees and tomorrow was going to be 113, then I'd say, yeah, just stay home and water your own trees. Like that's going to be a bad day for a lot of reasons. Yeah. So I think what we want to do is just to space things out a little bit. We're going to set up some tables in this area right here, and I will, as an area set up, I will just go tree by tree. You all can just start maybe a couple people at a time working on a tree, and we'll just see how many we can bring through. The only other thing I wanted to mention is if you have a cork bark, you're going to get different instructions. The process is a little different, and I recommended to Daniel some small trees like these. You can probably wait another 2 weeks before decandling. In general, when you start decandling in your garden, you do all the biggest trees, then a week or two later you do the middle trees, a week or two later you do the smallest trees. You finish with the show, and then you make your adjustments based on that. Because we want longer needles on bigger trees, medium needles on medium trees, and small needles on small trees. And our number one control for needling is going to be the day on which we decandle. In other words, how many days are left in that growing season? Will it be 90, 105, or 120? Give or take.
So less days in the growing season, and it's gonna get smaller.
And we're not giving them much time, right? Because if we were doing a long-term talk on pine, I would teach you some different stuff, which is, I would say, just to leave you all with a confusing note, the length of a needle on a pine tells you how healthy that tree is or how well it's growing in the current year. If these needles look great, I can tell the tree's having a good 2025. If the needles were longer, I'd say it's even longer. The number of needles that grew tells you how healthy the tree was last year because pines set their buds a year in advance. And so based on the length of these needles, I would say this tree had a very nice time last year. Ted treated it well. And the elements did. The size of the bud at the end of the branch that sets in fall, that tells you the tree's prediction about how good the next year is going to be. And so by looking at a tree, you can kind of tell, is it getting stronger or is it getting weaker? And that makes it really easy for us diagnosticians about how we're going to treat a tree based on whether it's on an upward swing or a downward swing. And that may inform how we prune it any given day.
So that means like people should journal, document what they're doing. Like
If you don't have perfect recall and you want to be more effective at the following year, notes are a good way to do that. I am horrible at taking notes. I know writing hundreds of blog posts a year kind of belies that, but I take lots of pictures. And so sometimes I literally just take a picture of a tree, and so I'll just do that right now. This will remind me what day I decandled that tree that year. It might not even be a helpful reference photo, but it can be a helpful reference photo. And so if you're just used to taking pictures before and after you work on your trees, you'll have a good idea about the dates and whether or not you were effective by going back next year.
I felt like it's helpful to write down like how many needles was on the bottom row and how many needles on the upper row.
I'd say the more data you have and are able to process, the more quickly you can kind of dial in exactly the best thing to do on your garden. In general, it's always going to be a field because all trees present differently, and they're going to change from year to year based on the weather, based on fertilizer, the water quality, forest fires, who knows, house fires, whatever it's going to be. And so I always want to learn what are the patterns we're looking at and then have that result.
So if we have a tree that's, regardless of size, it's a pine that's healthy and pretty close to how we like to show it, its branches are where we want it and all of that. Regardless of size of tree, would you then, based on what you said, recommend that we decandle it as late as we feel comfortable doing? Small, grow small, or does that not apply?
It's more like I'm giving you the information so you can answer that question with your goals in your garden.
Right.
And so, but in the abstract, we're just going to go with general calendar recommendation. I will ask, what microclimate do you live in?
Right.
And so you all have lots of microclimates down here, just like I do. And if you tell me you live an hour and a half east of here, I'm going to say you can wait a couple weeks because it's hot as blazes out there. And I'm going to say if you live in Huntington Beach and you don't remember what the sun looks like, then I'm going to say maybe you decandled 2 weeks ago. Something.
And that's regardless if the tree is like show ready or not, we wanted you to more or less to sit.
Right. So when I'm preparing a pine for show, I look at literally what is the date of the show, and I'm going to plan my decandling strategy around that. I might prune and thin it differently. I'm going to pluck it differently, and I'm going to time it differently. When I showed a pine in New York in September, I decandled 4 weeks early because their show is in September 15th, and my pine's going to grow for another month and a half. And so it looked great on show day, but it looked stupid by the time fall rolled around, and it just had long needles that way. By the same token, when I prepared a tree for the Pacific Bonsai Expo last fall, we actually, instead of cutting down to pairs of branches, 2 years in a row, it was so dense, we cut down to one branch on the end of every branch, because we knew that if you have one decandle that end up with two, you're ending up with a density you want to land on. We'll be getting to that next year when we've mastered everything else there is. Anyway, about ready to get going? And so, Daniel, where do you want us to put these chairs right here? While we move some tables.
You can just fold them up. That'd be great. Thank you.
Folding up the chairs, and then we'll arrange the tables.